All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining us this evening. And we are going to be covering the San Jacinto Riverways Pits Superfund site at this community meeting. And my name is Jackie Medcalf. I'm the Executive Director of Texas Health and Environment Alliance. Before we get too far into the presentation, just a couple of ground rules, a little bit of housekeeping. I ask that y'all are respectful of one another and all of our different opinions, and that we're all respectful of time. I will do my best to get everybody out of this meeting by 7 o'clock. And for the bulk of the presentation, all lines will be muted, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions or thoughts, concerns, anything that you want to bring to our attention during the presentation, feel free to drop it in the chat or jot it down on your end, and we can definitely address that in the later portion of the meeting. All right, so first and foremost, I would like to get started tonight with some recent community concerns and something that many of us were scrambling over the last 2 weeks by now to work on. Hopefully y'all received an email or heard about this on our social media about some development on River Road in Channelview that raised a lot of concerns, not only in Harris County, but in several other counties. So this is a on the ground photo here of development that's been going on for quite some time and has been pretty controversial in the local community there. However, on March 12th, we were notified about a letter of permission to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the letter was dated March 4th. And in that letter, it stated that there would be a 15-day comment period, which would end on March 19th. Very few local residents were notified of this. And like I said, we did not find out until March 12th, which I believe was a Friday. And looking, going a Friday to the very next Friday of having a tight turnaround, it was a scramble. And we definitely had to quickly pivot and hear what the community's concerns were, understand what this letter of permission meant, and figure out where to go from there. So one of the items that we saw with this letter of permission, and that we saw previously with a application to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to dredge part of the riverbed in this area, was previously it was to in the application process previously, a few years ago, the dredged material would have gone to Beach City. Y'all might remember that. There was a pretty big outcry in the local community and in the community of Beach City, not wanting this dredged material to go there. And then again, with this letter of permission, we saw the same thing where the local government, where the dredged material would go or was proposed to go, was not notified. And that's because there's simply no requirement for the local government to be notified where material goes to, whether it's dredged material like this, it kind of has at this point in time unknown characteristics, or whether it's even hazardous material. And when we went through this last time in Chambers County, and the city of Beach City were just going, why weren't we notified? The response we were getting from the agency was, if we notified every small government and every town every time hazardous or solid waste was being moved into their community, it would be a constant notification process. And, I guess the additional feedback I got was this type of stuff moves constantly on our roadways. And so as of right now, there's no requirement, but luckily some of the Channelview residents did receive notification about this letter of permission and quickly notified the surrounding government as well as Thea. So I have a couple of maps here that I want to direct your attention to. And so first is the one with the big red outline on the left-hand side of the screen. This is the defined area by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA in an interagency agreement that this is the area of concern for the San Jacinto River Waste Pits Superfund site. You can see here in the purplish color, the San Jacinto waste pits are indicated. The northern pit is indicated there. And anything that is within this area and requesting a permit to dredge is supposed to go through a specific permitting process. Basically, rather than going through the normal permitting process, anything in this area has additional checks and balances that it is supposed to go through to improve, I guess, if you will, the chances of this material being analyzed and not being contaminated. And if it is, then it would have to then be addressed prior to it being disposed of. So there's a specific sampling process that any dredged material in this area is supposed to go through. Any permit application within this red area, this whole area, because of the decades that those waste pits sat there, the fact that the waste material has made its way throughout this environment, and the potential for sediments within this area of concern to have contaminants from the waste pits. Now, I want to direct your attention to the right-hand side, the top map with the blue outline. So this map here, you're only seeing part of it, the part that needs your attention for this purpose. This is the outline of the Superfund site in and of itself, which has three primary areas of concern, 2 pits and 1 other area. So this blue outline here outlines, you're seeing the northern portion of what is considered the Superfund area. The red outline is the northern pit. Again, the yellow outline, which is cut off by about half, is the southern waste pit. Over here, what's not outlined is the sand separation area. And if you notice, right where this line cuts on the west and the land slumps down right here, that's where the proposed dredging could take place for this letter of permission. So you can it's easy to see that map to map by this little peninsula that sticks out right here. If you're now looking to the bottom map, the peninsula is right here. So this is the outer edge of the designated Superfund area per EPA designation. And right here is where you saw that on the ground photo in the previous slide. Okay, so this is a copy of the plan details for this proposed project, and we're looking at an aerial view of the property. So you'll see here in the legend several different items of what the different either cross sections or colors mean on this map. And I want to direct your attention first to the green color. These are wetlands that the applicant states that they would avoid disturbing or dredging in this effort. You'll notice there are, several areas of defined wetlands in this project area. And wetlands play a critical role to our ecosystem. And when it comes to flooding, they are very important for flooding, for filtration, and a vital habitat. So it's important that, we protect our wetlands, of course. And then what I next want to direct your attention to is the area with the diagonal lines through it, which you'll notice protrudes from the land out here, so out into the river. So this whole area is the proposed dredging area. And what this ultimately would be, if it is allowed by the Army Corps of Engineers, it would be a barge storage facility. So mind you, again, this is north of Interstate 10, and that was one of the big concerns with community members, right? Is that, here this location is north of Interstate 10, and there would be proposed mooring locations where these yellow stars are. There's 3 here and 2 over here. So barges would be tied up and stored at this facility. Okay, now we're looking at a map of the proposed project for disposal. So the material was proposed to go to Devers, which is in Liberty County, and it's a plot of land that the applicant owns in that area. It is primarily a wooded area. And I don't know, the future land use of the area, but right now it is, a very wooded area. And as you can see here, oops, sorry about that. As you can see here, they propose putting down a clay liner and then building up the dredge spoil on top of that with some silt fencing and a little bit of built up land, just a couple of feet on the outside perimeters. And then they would have a gradient that would go up ultimately to 6 feet tall. So essentially kind of creating a little hill, in the middle of this this land that was not the natural topography. So the local government where this would take place was very concerned about the potential threats here to flooding in the local area, potential impacts of groundwater. The people who live in this area primarily rely on groundwater wells. And although, parts of the town itself have other infrastructure, there's a lot of people that rely on groundwater wells. And there was no way that I could tell, the mayor or the folks at the county level of where this waste was going, that it is or is not contaminated. Without adequate testing of this material, there's no way to say for sure. So what's been done? So in the past, there has been sampling done in the proposed dredging area. I am not certain that it was an adequate amount of sampling, but what I do know for sure is that it's not relevant today, because that sampling, to the best of my knowledge, was done prior to Tropical Storm Imelda. We all know that the waste pits are located in a tidally influenced waterway. So not only did they sit there in the river unprotected for decades and potentially impacted by daily tides coming in and out every day, but also there's, great potential for storm surge over the years, when we've had different hurricanes and major storms to bring the material upstream. So part of the big problem with the process here is that this wasn't a full application process. This wasn't the extra protective process, that the Army Corps and the EPA laid out for the area of concern. This was a letter of permission. So it would not require all of the checks and balances that a full process would. It's still part of, an application process, but it's not the full thing. So the community very quickly got activated. We all remember Imelda. No chance we can forget the barges that struck Interstate 10, the months of, trouble that caused for residents near and far that need to travel across Interstate 10. It impacted business greatly in the area. It was just a huge mess and an emergency response also that required a lot of tax dollars for our responders to be out there and to be working on this. And then, the bottom picture, we also cannot forget the loaded barge that struck and grounded on that northern pit. It was not a good situation. It could have been worse. It undoubtedly could have been worse, but it was a bad situation. So very quickly, the local community activated, as did our local government, Chambers County, Liberty County, and the city of Devers, the city where the proposed dredge material would go. Also, state representatives got involved. And again, remember, this was 7 days, only 5 business days. And there was huge activation around this. 2 local state representatives got involved and submitted comments to the Army Corps of Engineers opposing this letter of permission. We had hosted a letter on our website, and by 5 o'clock on the 19th, the Friday, which was the deadline, we submitted 355 letters of opposition to the Army Corps of Engineers. So in 7 days, 355 people took their time to sign this letter that we hosted. That's not an account for people who, took it upon themselves to call the Army Corps or write letters themselves. We also saw others, rallying around this issue. Channelview Health and Improvement Coalition, Lone Star Legal Aid, the Sierra Club Houston chapter, other organizations, nonprofits, community groups, all rallied in concern over the potential for there to be a barge storage facility north of Interstate 10. And what you're seeing here on the screen, these images are a big part of why folks are so concerned about this. Where you see this barge here stuck under Interstate 10 in Imelda is right by the waste pits. This is not the one that beached, as you can see in the bottom picture. It's not the one that beached on the pit. But within, these orange buoys are the outermost markers from the waste pits. And so up in this area, that is literally the Superfund site. And that's what I say, when it was not a good situation. It could have been a lot worse. It came uncomfortably close. So we have some larger issues here. First and foremost, the process outlined by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA to put adequate checks and balances in place, or put tighter, measures in place in this area of concern, aren't even being adhered to. This isn't the first time we've seen something like this in the area. It's not uncommon for work within the area of concern to take place and then someone to apply for an after the fact permit and it be granted. That's a big problem. You can see here, this is the top part of the letter of permission, interagency coordination. What interagency coordination is going on? I don't know of any. I don't know that the communication between the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers was there on this effort. It's my understanding that the EPA did not comment to the Corps on this effort. That's concerning. So there's a communication breakdown. And then looking back at, what took place in Imelda, have we not learned anything? Are we discussing this from a proactive approach, or are we going to go with the same perspective we had prior to Imelda and put tugboat operators' lives on the line in hopes of them being able to contain fugitive barges in a storm surge scenario? It's not a good approach, and we need our agencies to be doing better. So there is then the next issue that's part of this larger item here is the lack of public notification. Many local residents did not receive any notification about this. Residents who literally are less than a quarter of a mile from the proposed barge facility. Then we get to the Army Corps' information that they put out publicly. The 2 email addresses where people were directed by the agency to submit comments were wrong. There were typos. They were ultimately corrected, I believe midweek, the week of the deadline, after being pointed out. But the public notices that are going out have the wrong email address for people to submit their concerns. So there's altogether a large disconnect here for the public's ability to be aware of these issues and participate in these processes. And from what we've seen time and time again over the years, this is a pattern of practice. And it is time, it is beyond time, that this is chased up the ladder. And so, please feel free to follow up with me, express your concerns. If you want to write a letter, to the Corps, if you want to, submit your concerns to me in writing, give me a call, what have you, please do so. Because we're looking at working with some of our partners right now to address these larger issues that we need to stop. One thing here that we have to be critically aware of is the future activities in this area. So, Texas Department of Transportation will be replacing the Interstate 10 bridge at the San Jacinto River flyover or crossover. And that is supposed to start in mid 2025. Now, the other, which it's a really tight channel right there. So that's going to be likely going to be impacting the navigable waterway. Then you have the Superfund site, the EPA activities, right? So remediation at the northern pit is hopefully going to start in the next couple of years. So what we have maybe by 2023, the actual remediation could begin at the northern pit. And in parallel, you will have two major construction processes going on in that tiny little navigable waterway right there. And we have to see interagency coordination. We have to see a navigation plan. It's imperative for, the local community, but also for the safety of not only the workers at the construction site, not only the local community, but also those that are traveling over Interstate 10. These plans must be in place to avoid and do everything possible to mitigate a potential strike. Okay. Sorry, I was reading something there. Let's now shift to talk very specifically about the San Jacinto River Waste Pits Superfund site and what the latest updates are there. All right, so last time we met, I was still waiting on hearing the feedback from the January inspection. I think we actually met the week that it started. And I very recently received the report from that inspection. And the quarterly inspections that take place are done by the responsible parties, contractors, and then they submit a report to the EPA for review. So a visual inspection took place on January 7th. The visual inspection is what's done quarterly. And they observed that there was one fallen sign. And I believe it is the sign I'm showing here in an image, which are the outer facing signs on that northern pit. And they're danger and trespassing signs. And the theory there is that it will detour or prevent boaters or fishermen, people from coming onto the Superfund site itself. Though we know it has not detoured people from fishing right there beside the site. But nonetheless, I'll show you a map in a minute of where those signs are located. Also, there were 4 of the lit up buoys that were found to not be operating. Their lights were not working. The lights blink. And so 4 buoys, their lights will be replaced. And then they observed extra geotextile. So there's that black tarp-like material that's over part of the waste pit. And there was excess material that was observed, and the conclusion is that when there were repairs made in the past, that this material was not cut, um, as it, cut, snuff enough to where the rocks are. So they're going to be cutting that extra material off of that geotextile. They also conducted a bathymetric survey and topographic survey, which essentially allows them to look at the land elevation of not only the pit itself, but the sides, the side slopes, side walls, and the riverbed. And that took place January 11th through 15th. Those results from the January 2021 bathymetric and topographic surveys were compared to the last time those types of surveys took place, which was October of last year. And that's in the report, it was figure 3, and I'll show you figure 3 here in a moment. One thing, that the surveys showed was, both deposition and erosion are occurring, and I'll elaborate that when I have the map up. Okay, so we are looking at an aerial view of the Superfund site from a map that was in the report that I received from the EPA. And these are the buoys I showed you earlier. This is where in that photo the barge was lodged. And so these are the location and indicators for the outline of buoys. And so again, 4 of those need the lights to be replaced. And then all of these little triangle markers represent the danger and no trespassing signs that I showed you an image of. And one of those, was toppled over and is going to be repaired. Okay, and then this is the outcome of the bathymetric and topographic survey. And anywhere where you see the warmer colors, that's indicating erosion. That's indicating that, that material was removed. And so this black outline, outermost outline here, is the northern pit. Most of it's underwater, right? Let me go back to the previous map. Most of it's underwater. But this is the waste pit, the northern waste pit, all in here. And as you can see, on an average tide, over 60% of the site is underwater, and there's usually this small area that you can observe above water. Again, this is the southern pit down here. So what, the surveys showed was little spots of erosion on the riverbed around that northern pit. Anywhere on here you see the cooler colors, the blue and the purplish color, that indicates that there's additional sediment there, that there's a difference in depth that's greater than what it was in October. So ideally, in a normal circumstance, this is primarily a depositional environment. Primarily, this area receives sediment. The bottom surface accumulates sediment over time in normal conditions. But again, it has spots of erosion, and we all know in a flood or storm scenario, and in other potential scenarios, the potential and reality of erosion is great. All right, so timeline moving forward on this. We have been waiting for the final design report for that southern impoundment. So the EPA submitted comments to the responsible parties contractors on the southern impoundment. And now the agency is waiting for the final report to be sent back to them from the responsible parties consultants. And my understanding is that when that document is finalized and the EPA releases it publicly, that it will have the comments that the agency submitted to the contractors. So it'll be, not only interesting to see kind of what the responsible parties consultants said, they believe the plan should be moving forward for remediation of the southern pit, but also what the agency came back, the EPA and other agencies came back and commented on, and then if there's been any course correct from there. The EPA is expecting the final report back to them from the responsible parties contractors this week. Then for the northern impoundment, my understanding is that we're still on target for the pre-final design to be turned into the EPA by the responsible parties contractors by April. And then that final design, we are anticipating it will be released this June. Now, once we have these final documents in place, remediation process can start. That doesn't mean, and a consent decree is put in place. That doesn't mean, though, that you will see construction right away. They anticipate it to take 2 years to procure the materials for remediation. All right. Shifting gears to quickly talk about public health in the area. So next week, we will be launching a large health survey initiative. Just about every meeting, we talk about health surveys and why we host the health survey on our website. One of our team members is going to be dropping the link to our health survey in the chat. But we're going to be launching this large initiative next week where we are, our goal is to receive 500 health surveys across the 3 communities in Harris County that we work with, but to talk specifically about the communities around the waste pits. We last did a study on cancer rates in the area with Texas Department of State Health Services over 5 years ago. And so it's been quite some time since we've been able to get data on different types of cancer and what their rates were within the community. And it's so important that we have y'all's help, that we hear from y'all, those of you living in this area, and what your cancer or disease diagnoses are in your household. Because without knowing what types of cancer are out there, we won't know what to ask the state to look into. They can only go into the cancer registry and pull cancer rates by individual cancer types. So last time we worked with them on this, we asked them to pull 18 different types of cancer for this study area that we commonly see in the community. 14 of those 18 cancer types, 14 came back in abnormally high rates. Now that's just what we've asked them to look into. So we don't know what else is out there. So we will be asking for those 18 cancer types to be reevaluated so we can assess how the rates are doing from the last study to now, or to the latest cancer registry data. But we need to know what else is out there. And when we get a better understanding of the community's health, we'll be able to advocate more for the protection of public health in your community. All right, so looking forward, we're going to have our next town hall on May 4th. And our town halls, remember, are where we talk about all of our program areas and we give like the most pertinent, the most important updates. And then in late May, we're going to have, in late May or early June, depending on when research is wrapped up, we're going to have a presentation with some partners of ours at Rice University, where we will be talking about some GIS maps that we're working on related to flooding and industrial facilities and Superfund sites. And so I'm really looking forward to that, the research that we're working on, concluding that and being able to bring that back to y'all. I don't on the calendar have the next community meeting for San Jacinto. Now, between now in June, we will likely have another San Jacinto specific meeting if something important arises. For example, this southern impoundment's final design. If we get that between now and then and have the ability to have our technical team work on digesting that report, then we will absolutely, make the announcement, send out emails, have phone calls, letting y'all know that we are hosting a public meeting to present, our review of that final report. And then from there, we are going to be just playing it by ear for about a month or two, as I am almost 7 months pregnant right now. And so we are expecting me to go into labor in early June. And so we're playing it by ear for then. And depending on what happens, then the team and I will, bring you the information, any information as we get it. That's important to be sure we get to y'all. And, during the summer months, it might not look like this. It might not be me presenting, but it would be potentially one of our team members. But I just want to let you know that we still will be, making sure that we get you guys information as it comes in. All right, so let's see. All right, so I think what I saw first was something come in the Q&A. Okay, so for someone submitted in the Q&A, Hurricane Harvey, I'm reading what someone submitted. How would this proposed solution avoid the consequences of toxic material, again, breaching the impoundments and spreading throughout communities? So I believe you're asking about remediating the waste pits. And so like in Hurricane Harvey, what took place, or Ike, any of these past storms where the waste pits were there. Essentially, the record of decision outlined the remedy for the waste pits, and the waste pits will be fully removed. That northern pit will be removed from the river. So once that pit is fully removed, then the risk of it being disrupted in future storms it is also removed, right? Because that pit, that source of waste, this is source pollution. We know where the source is. You can point to it. It will be removed. So it essentially, takes out that very risky component from that vulnerable location. Okay, I see Steve Daniels. You have your hand up, and then there's a question in the chat I will address. Steve, did you have a question or a comment that you wanted to ask? Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Please feel free to hop in or drop something in the chat. So let's address an item here that's, oh, okay. Thanks, Steve. We're good there, y'all. That's also in the chat. If history repeats itself. When the waste pits were created, the pits were dug, filled, and covered with the thought it would not be a problem in the future. It was contained. This incident was very similar to what was proposed for the Three River Road to Devers scenario. So kind of the difference there, when the waste pits were constructed, they actually weren't covered, and they weren't maintained. They weren't monitored. By the late 1960s, the waste pits were abandoned. And part of the the agreement on the waste pits being allowed to be put there by the health department. Back then we didn't have pollution control, we didn't have EPA, but part of the agreement was that they could put the waste on the bank of the river, but they had to maintain the outer berms. By 1968, they abandoned and were no longer maintaining those berms. And by the early 70s, there was a notable breach in one of the berms. And so definitely a difference there. It wasn't until 2011 that a temporary cap was put over part of that northern pit. All right, let's see. We've got another question here. Okay. All right, a question here, or statement in question. In its letter of response to the city of Devers, Holt Marland, who is the Army Corps applicant, Holt Marland said it had completed sampling of the dredge site. The letter did not say when the samples were taken. You mentioned it was before Imelda. Where can that information be found? Great question. So my understanding, to the best of my knowledge, is that the sampling that took place was in the earlier application process that Holtmar attempted at this property. And that was several years ago. And so I do believe that you can still access that information. Let me pull up my PowerPoint so you can get the application number. If you Google the application, you should be able to find that information on the Army Corps website. There were a lot of issues found in that letter, and I really appreciate and I value communication, but it would be nice if communication were upfront and honest and not in a defense and more in a misleading way. And so anyways, here you see the permit application number. It's SWG-2015-00855. If you Google that, you should be able to find the earlier documentation, which I believe the online copies do include that sampling material. And then also, I'm sorry I don't have a link prepared for y'all, but if you go to the Army Corps of Engineers Galveston District's website, on their homepage and several other pages, they have the interagency agreement between the Army Corps and the EPA for the San Jacinto River Waste Pits area of concern. And towards the back of that document, it's a PDF document. Towards the back of that document, it outlines the sampling protocol for any proposed dredging in the area of concern. Sure. Okay, thank you, Mrs. Stone. So Mrs. Stone dropped here in the chat that the erosion observed at the waste pits is an even greater reason to make sure sampling and analysis of any dredge material from the air, sampling and analysis of any dredge material from the area. And the sampling report that is out there for, I believe it's Casey, is from August of 2016. So that's the last available data that we have seen from the proposed area. I'm going to go back to okay. All right, so a question here. I would like to know who the responsible parties are using as their consultants and contractors. It would be helpful to know of their environmental track records. All right, so there's a couple, and the entity that built the cap in 2011 is still the entity that does the inspections and any maintenance and repairs for the cap, and that's Anchor Integral. And from my understanding of that company, they are known for the caps that they construct and are like one of the great cap builders. But the problem here, why this cap has needed repairs and had breaches nearly every year since 2011, is because it's simply not an applicable environment for containment. According to the EPA's own guidelines for in situ containment, meaning in place containment, is that it's a shallow, low flow environment. This is neither of those at all. And so Anchor Integral, I think it's QEA, is the contractor there. And then the contractor for the remediation, the entity that is doing the design work for the actual construction of for the record of decision and cleaning up the site, is GHD. And I believe it's GHD's Louisiana or office in Louisiana that is tasked with being the contractor for the actual cleanup. Okay, awesome. Tracy, if you could grab the link that Carolyn submitted and then drop that in the chat. We'll have a link here in the chat that I believe is the Army Corps' document for the area of concern. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back to a map. Okay, I want to direct your attention to the map on the left. So as I mentioned, here we have the northern waste pit. Here, unmarked in this map, is the southern waste pit. And then up here is a shallower area of contamination from the original, from a previous dredging effort in the area. That runoff created this shallower area of contamination of the waste pits material. And so you have these three areas. And this is, again, a tidally influenced waterway. So every day you have tides coming in and going out. And then you have the periodic storm surge that comes in. And dioxin from the waste pits was found in many of the areas right around here that were investigated by the EPA and the Superfund process. Now, they did not go beyond this blue line here. They did not go further up north and beyond that blue line, because you have to define an area where the extent of your investigating is done. And dioxin, is when it's released over time and at varying points, it's not going to be out there like you would imagine an oil sheen, right? Like it's not going to be out there in from past releases in this well-defined area. It's going to be hit or miss, and unless you grab that specific area, that specific spot where the dioxin was deposited, you're not going to find it. And so anyway, so it's something that if they were to just exhaust this whole area of sampling, I mean, we're talking millions of dollars. It's not feasible to test this, every foot of this entire area. And so they focus their investigation more tightly within that blue line. And so what we know is that over time, releases have occurred. Over time, a likely vector of a likely force moving the material around is the water flow. And part of that is tides. And so someone had dropped, why I'm bringing this back up is because someone had dropped in the chat about the erosion that was observed in this recent study shown here in some of these eroded areas is, just further support that updated testing needs to be done in the proposed dredging area for that barge facility, not for the waste pits remediation, but for this is back to that Army Corps letter of permission process. But that, we know this area gets eroded from time to time. And we know that this site has been breached. And we know that since 2016, we've had some storms and incidences that have taken place. And we need, more recent sampling to make sure that if that area is dredged for the barge facility, that it would not be, one, disturbing sediment that is contaminated, because then that could redistribute it throughout the river system. And two, to ensure that wherever this material were to go, that it would not cause problems and potentially contaminate where it is set to go. So where we are right now is we're waiting to hear back from the Army Corps and see what their response is to all of the concerns and questions raised, and what decision they've made, if they're going to grant this letter of permission, maybe require more sampling or a full application process. We asked for both. We asked for more sampling and a full application process, along with other things like more community notifications. So we'll keep y'all updated on what we learn about that. And I'll go ahead and ask for one more round of questions. If anybody has anything, please feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat before we conclude. All right, let's see. Okay, so there's a statement here about someone who called Brian Babin's office to find out his position on the Army Corps issue. And Dawn is saying here that Mr. Babin or Mr. Babin's office refused to give Babin's his position, but simply would state, that they were aware of it. We were coordinating with Babin's office, but I did not ever get like a conclusion to, whether or not they submitted any type of feedback for or against the effort. Our elected officials absolutely should be concerned about this, because when Interstate 10 was shut down after Imelda, all of our elected officials showed up, right? There was this grand press tour. We were also coming up on an election, and now we need them to be having these conversations. So thank you, Dawn, for calling them, for pressing for answers to this. And I encourage all of you to call your officials, your representatives, and let them know that you're concerned about this. Let them know your position, and that we need them to hold these agencies and entities accountable. It's a very big problem that our government agencies are not even following their own processes that they've outlined. So he's asking here, shouldn't Mr. Babin, lead the charge against approval, since the Army Corps is federal and not state? We definitely need all levels, coming together on this, because this is, at the end of the day, an issue that impacts much, much more than just that immediate local community. And it is something also that does, like you're saying, involve all branches of our government. And so it's definitely important that, we are engaging with our officials, and we need to see a proactive conversation going on here. We need to see our officials and our agencies talking to one another, coming together, sitting down at the table or across Zoom, what have you, but having these conversations and figuring out what's going to take place, what are the steps to mitigate, what's going to be allowed, and where we go from there. Okay, so someone is asking if there will be a list from the Army Corps of those who responded or opposed. I'm not certain. I know in the Superfund process, right? They actually put out what people comment or what concerns people express and what the agency's response is. I don't know that the Army Corps does this. I haven't seen it. Doesn't mean that they don't, but I'm just unaware of it. But I will look into that and I'll get an answer back to you to see, if by chance they'll put something out. One thing I do know is that when an elected official called, the Army Corps called Brian Bader, who is the person at the Galveston district that's been involved with this permit application process, when a local official called him and asked him why they were even allowed to submit a letter of permission, because of the fact that a letter of permission should only be used when it's a minor job and there's not opposition expected. And what I was told was that the Army Corps said that they didn't anticipate that this job would bring about any opposition, which I find very interesting, because when this was going through the application process a few years ago, there was a tremendous amount of opposition and it ended up getting halted. There, again, multiple governments coming together, hundreds of community members, city resolutions, county resolutions being passed to the east of here. And so for someone who's continuously been involved with this application, it was a little surprising to see that they didn't suspect there to be opposition. And anyone certainly can submit a Freedom of Information Act request to the Army Corps very specifically for any comments or items related to this permit. So Carolyn, you might want to consider that. We can talk about that. All right, folks, those are all the questions that I have. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening. And I will look forward to seeing y'all in the town hall, if not before then. Good night.